It was another Sunday in a quiet Florida town, the church bells ringing, families dressed in their Sunday best, and Pastor Dave Hendricks expected to deliver his usual sermon. But this morning the congregation was met with haunting news. 17-year-old Paula Hendricks, Pastor Dave's daughter, had gone missing overnight. Hours later, her lifeless body was discovered on a secluded patch of land just outside the town limits. No one understood how a pastor's family could be struck by such tragedy, especially on a day meant for worship. Whispers circulated. Was it an accident? A runaway gone wrong? Or was something far more sinister at play? Yet as details emerged, and as eyes turned to Pastor Dave, the real story that surfaced would shake the very foundations of the church. Because this wasn't just about a missing daughter, it was about a dark secret that had twisted the bonds of faith, family, and desire beyond repair. Stay with me, because the truth behind Paula's death, and who orchestrated it, will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, devotion, and sin. In a modest Florida town just a few miles off the interstate, life moved at a steady, predictable pace. The community's social lifeblood flowed through a small network of local businesses, a diner, a family-owned grocery store, and the Grace of Mercy Church, where Pastor Dave Hendricks led Sunday worship. Most residents didn't lock their doors until nightfall, trusting in the familiarity of longtime neighbors. For Dave Hendricks, preaching was more than a calling. It was the identity he'd cultivated over 2 decades. Church members spoke of his humble beginnings, an orphan who found faith and turned it into a ministry. Over time, he became the face of Grace of Mercy Church, guiding baptism ceremonies, visiting sick congregants, and helping couples navigate marital strife. Publicly, he was admired for his calm demeanor and his knack for turning biblical teachings into relatable lessons. Yet behind his pulpit persona, the Hendricks family had its own delicate balance. Jason Johnson, Dave's father-in-law, was a decorated war veteran who wrestled with bouts of PTSD. Some days he was sociable and eager to help around the church. Other times he isolated himself, haunted by the battles he'd fought overseas. Sheila Johnson, his wife and Mitchell Hendricks' mother, was a fixture at church events, always ready with a tray of baked goods or a listening ear for anyone in crisis. She found solace in prayer groups, quietly nursing the loneliness that her husband's unpredictable episodes created. In this close-knit setting, Mitchell Hendricks, Dave's wife, juggled her role as a daughter, mother, and support system to her husband's pastoral duties. Their daughter, Paula, was a vibrant 17-year-old who spent her free time practicing for school sports. Known for her curiosity and quick smile, Paula was a regular sight around the church, often helping with youth programs. For outsiders, life in this small Florida town seemed uncomplicated and harmonious, but the cracks beneath the surface, Jason's hidden trauma, Sheila's unmet needs, and Dave's rising internal conflicts, were about to collide in a way no one could have expected. This was the environment in which a devastating secret would take root, setting the stage for a crime that would unravel their shared faith and shatter the illusions of a perfect pastor's home. It all started quietly, so quietly, in fact, that no one recognized the moment for what it truly was. It was one of those evenings when Jason Johnson felt well enough to indulge in a little adventure. The war veteran hadn't had an episode in weeks, and the crisp Florida twilight seemed perfect for a drive through the countryside. One evening, Jason suggested her daughter take her to see the hills after dinner, his eyes flickering with renewed spirit. Days when Jason felt sociable were precious, small glimpses of the man he used to be before nightmares and anxiety had taken a toll. Paula, never one to miss out on time with her grandpa, grabbed her jacket and hurried to the car. Within minutes, the trio was on the road, leaving the Hendricks house behind under the soft glow of porch lights. Pastor Dave was supposed to be preparing for next Sunday's sermon, but he figured a quiet evening alone might give him time to collect his thoughts. He had grown accustomed to solitude, or so he thought. The first sign that something was off came in the form of a gentle knock at the door. It was Sheila Johnson, his mother-in-law. Seeing her at the house alone wasn't unheard of. She sometimes dropped by with homemade treats or stopped in for quick conversations about church events. Yet, this time, Sheila seemed different. Her demeanor was noticeably tense, though she masked it with a practiced smile. She carried no baked goods, no crocheted blankets, none of the comforting items she usually toted around. Instead, she brought a peculiar energy that Pastor Dave couldn't quite name. She excused herself with a little laugh. "Mitchell told me you were here alone," Sheila said, stepping into the living room. "I thought you might need some company. You're always so busy at the church." Dave offered a polite nod, unsure of how to respond. He'd been ready to dive into sermon notes, but her unexpected visit threw him off balance. He noticed she was dressed more casually than usual, simple jeans, a fitted blouse, an outfit that accentuated her figure in a way he had rarely seen. Had she always dressed like this? He wondered, shaking off the thought. Sheila sat on the couch, crossing her legs slowly. She mentioned her husband's recent good spirits, how she was grateful for this upswing in his mood, then casually segued into talk about loneliness. "When Jason isn't himself," she said softly, "I feel like a widow. It's strange to mourn someone who's still alive." It was the kind of confession that straddled the line between seeking comfort and probing for deeper connection. Dave, in his pastoral role, often counseled church members who felt neglected or lonely. But something in Sheila's eyes made him uncomfortable. She wasn't just sharing. She was searching, waiting for a specific response. Their conversation danced around trivial church matters, but kept returning to more personal topics: intimacy, longing, emotional needs. Dave tried to steer the dialogue back to safer terrain. He brought up the youth program at church, the upcoming missionaries' visit, the rummage sale. But Sheila found a way to circle back to her own unhappiness, her desire for companionship, her frustration with feeling invisible as she aged. A quiet tension thickened in the room. Dave noticed the way Sheila leaned closer when she spoke, the way her hand occasionally brushed against his arm. For a fleeting moment, an unwelcome spark of physical awareness passed between them. He admonished himself immediately. "This is my wife's mother, a woman looking for solace, and I'm here as a pastor." Yet he couldn't ignore the distinct sense that she was crossing a line. He politely suggested they pray together, hoping the act would put the conversation on a spiritual path and quell whatever undercurrent was simmering. Sheila obliged, bowing her head, but even the prayer felt uneasy. Her voice carried a quiver that sounded more like suppressed excitement than spiritual fervor. When they finally finished, Sheila rose to leave, but not without a lingering touch on Dave's shoulder. She looked at him, eyes glinting with an intensity that made him swallow hard, and offered a soft parting smile. "Thank you for hearing me out, Dave," she said in a quiet, measured tone. "You're easy to talk to." The moment the door closed behind her, Dave felt an irrevocable change. Something more than a pastoral counseling session had just transpired. He found himself replaying every word, every gesture, every micro-expression on Sheila's face. Was he imagining things? Had she truly been flirting with him, or was he reading too much into a lonely woman's yearning for comfort? Why did he feel so disconcerted and oddly flattered? He pushed the thoughts away, deciding that maybe he needed a walk or a strong cup of coffee to clear his head. But the faint scent of Sheila's perfume still lingered in the living room, anchoring him in that unsettling moment. Little did he know, this was merely the first red flag, a quiet foreshadowing of a liaison that would soon grip him in a web of lust, fear, and guilt. And by the time Jason, Mitchell, and Paula returned that night, the house appeared the same as before, but the dynamic between Pastor Dave and Sheila had shifted in a way that neither of them would, or perhaps could, forget. A few weeks passed after Sheila's unsettling visit to Pastor Dave's home. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. The Sunday services continued, Jason's mood remained relatively stable, and Mitchell happily attended to her family duties. But beneath that fragile peace, a dangerous tension was building. The first red flag had been raised. Soon others would follow, each compounding the moral jeopardy that Dave and Sheila found themselves in. The next opportunity for Sheila and Dave to be alone arrived under similarly innocent circumstances. Jason had asked Mitchell and Paula to accompany him to a small community fundraiser, an event to support local veterans. He was eager to rejoin social life on his good days, and Paula, always close with her grandfather, jumped at the chance to help. Sheila claimed she had a headache and decided to stay home. Dave insisted he had to work on the upcoming sermon and pastoral duties. In reality, both were aware of a pull drawing them together, a curiosity tinged with guilt. Sheila approached Dave's home in the mid-afternoon, and he let her inside, telling himself that he couldn't appear rude. Once again, she brought neither food nor the usual small talk about church updates. This time, she didn't bother hiding her intentions. He hesitated for a moment, the reality of the situation tightening around him like a noose. He should ask her to go. But a part of him, lonely, curious, and perhaps seduced by the thrill of the forbidden, couldn't let the moment slip away. There was no casual conversation this time, no attempt to feign innocence. The two gravitated toward each other, entangled by a forbidden desire they hadn't yet dared to name. They fell into a passionate, frantic embrace, each fueled by the loneliness that plagued their private lives. When it was over, Dave sat on the edge of the couch, face buried in his hands. He muttered a prayer under his breath, half hoping for immediate divine intervention. Sheila, however, seemed oddly content, her loneliness momentarily eased by this unexpected intimacy. He said nothing. Silence sealed their unholy pact. While Dave and Sheila struggled to manage the growing tension of their secret, small signs began drawing attention in the wider family circle. One afternoon, Jason returned from a clinic appointment alone and found Sheila passed out in their bedroom. Her blouse was on backward, her undergarments tossed near the door. He assumed she'd come home in a hurry and collapsed into a nap due to her headache, or perhaps from stress. But something felt off. The house had an unfamiliar hush, and Sheila's face bore an expression of exhausted satisfaction, not the usual fatigue from her daily chores. Jason's PTSD-fogged mind questioned it, yet he quickly dismissed the thought, attributing it to his own anxieties. Also in the church, a newly arrived missionary, Brother Marcus, told a few congregants he had dreamt of Pastor Dave, gathering treasure and scattering it to the wind. The symbolic dream was vague, but rumors began to swirl. Some speculated it meant Dave was planning a major mission trip. Others wondered if it hinted at financial trouble. No one, not even Dave, suspected it might be a warning about something more personal. Dave's daughter Paula began noticing her grandmother's frequent errands and unexpected visits, though she never suspected anything sinister. Still, something about Sheila's demeanor felt different. More guarded, perhaps even excited. Mitchell, preoccupied with caring for her father, didn't question why Sheila might slip away more often or linger at the Hendricks house. For Pastor Dave, the secret affair tore at his conscience day and night. In the pulpit, he found himself sweating nervously during sermons on faithfulness and godliness. Every mention of sin or moral integrity felt like a personal rebuke. He contemplated confessing to Mitchell, but was paralyzed by the thought of her reaction, especially after hearing about Matthew, a church member who had allegedly been poisoned by his wife when he admitted to an affair. What if Mitchell does the same? Dave worried. The scenario looped in his mind until it turned into a genuine fear. Rationally, he knew his wife wasn't a murderer, but he couldn't shake the panic. He even avoided discussing Matthew's poisoning case with her, anxious that it might stir her suspicions. In hushed, tense moments alone with Sheila, Dave begged her to keep quiet. Sheila, however, showed no such reticence. She appeared almost emboldened by the secrecy. enjoying the adrenaline rush of their liaisons. She'd say things like, "No one will suspect a pastor and his mother-in-law." What began with a single awkward encounter had now turned into a pattern, an affair neither participant seemed able or willing to end. Each time they indulged their desire, they sank deeper into a moral quicksand, the weight of guilt pressing down on Dave's conscience and fueling Sheila's reckless confidence. Their darkest secret was still safely hidden, but secrets by nature crave exposure. And in a tightly knit community, especially one bound by church and family ties, it was only a matter of time before someone else would catch on to the strange tension between Dave and Sheila. The real question was, who would discover it first, and how catastrophic would the fallout be once the final truth emerged? The family routine took a sinister turn one day when Mitchell decided to take Jason to a VA hospital checkup, Paula tagging along for moral support. The trip was set for the late morning, and they planned to drive straight from the hospital to Paula's sports practice. Mid-ride, Paula realized she had forgotten her training gear at home. They swung by the house to grab her stuff, and Paula volunteered to run inside alone while her mother stayed in the car with Jason. She pushed open the front door, expecting an empty living room. Instead, she heard a muted gasp from somewhere down the hallway. Curious, Paula crept closer, only to find the door to Dave's study slightly ajar. Through the gap, she glimpsed her father in a state of partial undress, locked in a passionate embrace with her grandmother. Shock stopped Paula in her tracks. Time seemed to slow as she took in the impossible scene. Dave's panicked eyes, Sheila's bra undone, the guilt and alarm etched across both their faces. She couldn't scream. She couldn't move. In her confusion, she silently backed away, scrambled to grab her training kit from her room, and slipped out the front door, her heart thudding so loudly she thought it might give her away. Returning to the car, Paula wore the face of someone who had seen a ghost. Mitchell noticed, but assumed her daughter was upset for delaying their trip, especially since Paula uttered nothing but, "I'm fine." Paula's world had just exploded, yet she had nowhere to direct her shock, horror, or anger. How could she tell her mother? How could she even look at her father, her grandmother, the same way again? Dave quickly dressed and confronted Sheila in the aftermath. Dave knew better. Paula was his only child. She adored her grandfather, her mother, and had always respected him as a father and pastor. To betray that trust was unforgivable. He felt certain Paula would expose them. It was just a matter of when. Sheila, on the other hand, was terrified and emboldened at the same time. She couldn't imagine going back to the silent loneliness of her marriage. If Dave tried to distance himself now, she would do anything to keep him close. Days passed. Paula avoided her father at all costs, speaking to him only in clipped monosyllables. Mitchell assumed it was typical teenage moodiness. Jason remained mostly in his own world, lulled by the stability of his medication. Meanwhile, Paula wrestled with the moral burden of what she'd seen. Part of her wanted to corner her father and demand an explanation, or to run straight to her mother, tears streaming, and lay it all bare. Another part of her dreaded the chaos it would unleash. She loved her grandfather deeply and feared what this revelation might do to his fragile mental health. In desperation, Paula confided in Deaconess Jessica Taylor, a woman she trusted. Though she didn't spill every detail, she hinted at some sort of sexual misconduct involving Pastor Dave. Jessica urged her to speak openly, but Paula couldn't summon the courage just yet. Finally, Paula decided that enough was enough. If Dave wouldn't come clean to Mitchell, she would, or she'd bring it up in church if she had to. Sinful secrets like these, she thought, had no place in a family that claimed moral and spiritual leadership. Sheila and Dave soon learned of Paula's plan from an offhand comment she made to her father. Her threat to tell everyone in church sent Sheila into a panic. She had everything to lose: her marriage, her social standing, her entire life. Dave, meanwhile, was consumed by terror, replaying the tragedy of Matthew's poisoning in his mind. What if Mitchell lashed out the same way? What if she harmed Paula or even Dave himself? The tension crescendoed to an unspeakable conclusion. Sheila suggested that if Paula was going to ruin both their lives, maybe Paula needed to be stopped. In the hazy terror of that moment, morality slipped away entirely. Between Dave's mounting paranoia and Sheila's reckless desperation, they made a dark, irreversible choice, one that would cross the final line between hidden sin and homicidal madness. Up to this point, no blood had been shed, and most of the town remained clueless about the twisted web entangling the Hendricks and Johnson families. But Paula's threat was a ticking time bomb, and the fuse was burning fast. The real horror lay just beyond the next turn, where a father and a grandmother would choose the unthinkable to protect their secret. Soon, Paula would vanish, and the city that trusted Pastor Dave would be shaken to its core. The day before Sunday service, tensions erupted in the Hendricks household. Paula grew impatient, waiting for Pastor Dave to come clean about his affair with her grandmother, Sheila Johnson. That afternoon, she cornered Dave in his study, her voice quivering with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. "I'm telling Mom everything tomorrow if you don't do it first," she warned. "And if you don't have the courage, I'll speak to the church myself." Dave stood there, pale and trembling, torn between confessing and succumbing to fear. When Paula stormed out, he sank into a chair, realizing he had run out of time. As dusk settled over the small Florida town, Dave texted Paula from the living room. "Meet me outside in 15 minutes. I want to fix this, just us. Don't tell anyone." Paula, still hopeful her father might finally repent, slipped out quietly, leaving Mitchell and Jason dozing in their rooms. She got into Dave's car, noticing his anxious expression and the uneasy quiet in the neighborhood. He drove toward an unfinished housing development just outside the town limits, headlights cutting through the darkness. Unknown to Paula, Sheila followed in her own vehicle, keeping a discreet distance. Once Dave parked by a set of half-built foundations, Paula felt the first prickle of fear. Why come here in the dark? Sheila emerged from the shadows, face grim. Paula's eyes widened, realizing she'd been set up. She tried to run, but Dave grabbed her, tears streaming down his face as he pressed a cloth to Paula's mouth. The smell was sharp, some chemical that stung Paula's nose and sent her limbs thrashing in desperation. Moments later, Paula Hendricks went limp. Panicked, Dave and Sheila dragged Paula's body toward a cluster of overgrown bushes near the far edge of the property. The night was eerily quiet. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the rustling of tall grass. They left Paula under the cover of brush, hoping the darkness would conceal her. Once back in their cars, they parted ways. Sheila drove off first, wiping her tears and rehearsing a story in her mind. Dave sat trembling behind the wheel, haunted by what he'd just done. By the time they returned home, midnight was approaching. Mitchell was still asleep. Jason, in a half-lucid state due to his medication, barely registered Dave's return. At dawn, Mitchell awoke to find Paula's bedroom empty, her bed untouched. Alarm bells went off immediately. Paula never stayed out all night. Dave feigned ignorance, but Mitchell grew more anxious with every passing minute. She phoned Paula's friends, who insisted they hadn't seen her. Meanwhile, church members were gathering at Grace of Mercy Church, expecting Pastor Dave to deliver the Sunday sermon. When Paula failed to appear at service, concerned youth group members alerted Deaconess Jessica Taylor. Word spread quickly. The pastor's daughter is missing. Within hours, a small search party formed. Neighbors, churchgoers, and a few off-duty police officers combed through nearby streets and fields. Around mid-morning, 2 teenage boys walking near the unfinished housing development spotted something in the brush. At first, they thought it might be an injured animal. But as they drew closer, a wave of horror washed over them. They'd found Paula's body. The news hit the church like a lightning bolt. The service abruptly halted when people's phones buzzed with urgent messages. Gasps filled the sanctuary as the congregation learned that Paula had been found dead. Mitchell dropped to her knees, overcome by shock, while Jason broke into inconsolable sobs. Dave tried to mimic the same shock and grief, though inside he was numb, paralyzed by the realization that his world was about to crumble. Sheila hovered by Mitchell's side, putting on a show of maternal concern, even as her heart pounded with guilt and dread. The authorities arrived on site. Emergency vehicles blocked off the deserted construction zone as the coroner carefully removed Paula's body. This was no accident. The local sheriff, a longtime resident who had known the Hendricks family for years, vowed to leave no stone unturned. In a matter of hours, grief and shock morphed into something darker: suspicion. How did Paula end up in an unfinished development, alone, in the middle of the night? Had she been abducted? Had she run away and been attacked? No one yet dared suspect Pastor Dave, the beloved spiritual leader, the man who had baptized half the children in town and offered counsel to anyone in need. But faint whispers began circulating. Why was Dave acting so strangely? Why did Sheila appear overly distraught, her eyes darting around as though she feared an unseen threat? That Sunday afternoon, Grace of Mercy Church turned into an impromptu crisis center. Church members hugged one another, wept in the pews, and clung to Dave for some sense of comfort, never imagining he might be the culprit. Deaconess Jessica Taylor prayed with Mitchell, but she couldn't shake the memory of Paula's cryptic hints about her father's wrongdoing. Brother Marcus recalled his recurring dream of the pastor scattering treasure, certain now that it pointed to moral decay at the heart of their congregation. Meanwhile, Dave struggled to maintain composure, aware that the entire town looked to him for leadership during this tragedy. His public display of grief had to be flawless. If he faltered even once, revealing a crack in his sorrow or a misalignment in his story, the consequences would be catastrophic. The stage was now set for an explosive investigation that would rip apart the pastor's once untouchable image and place Sheila Johnson's role under the harsh glare of scrutiny. Mitchell and Jason, shattered by grief, would begin to recall overlooked details and questionable behaviors. And as the authorities dug deeper into Paula's final hours, inconsistencies would begin to appear in Dave's story. Shortly after noon, Detective Lorraine Phillips arrived on scene. Newly transferred from a bigger city, she was known for her no-nonsense approach and keen intuition. Phillips immediately took charge, sealing off the church's back offices to conduct interviews in private. Dave recounted a carefully rehearsed version of events. He'd last seen Paula in her room Saturday night. She seemed quiet, but not upset. When he awoke, she was gone. Detective Phillips pressed for more details. Did Paula have any issues at school? Any recent arguments at home? Dave managed to maintain his shaky composure, though the detective noted his occasional stammer and trembling hands. He attributed the trembling to grief and stress, but Phillips left the conversation with a peculiar feeling. He's either in profound shock, or there's something more, she noted in her log. Sheila sobbed on cue, painting Paula as a sweet girl who had no reason to run away. She expressed shock that anyone would harm her granddaughter. Phillips noticed Sheila was almost too eager to provide an alibi. She'd supposedly spent the entire evening at home, reading. No witnesses could confirm. Phillips found Mitchell inconsolable. She volunteered nothing but heartbreak, repeating that Paula had never been the type to leave without telling someone. Mitchell also mentioned a strain between Paula and Dave in recent weeks, attributing it to teenage mood swings, though she couldn't pin down specifics. The mention of tension put Detective Phillips on alert. There was a possibility of domestic conflict behind closed doors. Jason, Paula's grandfather, sat in the church's side chapel, expression haunted. His grief was palpable, yet there was something else, a flicker in his gaze that seemed more like awareness. The police had asked him a few preliminary questions, but Jason's PTSD and the cocktail of medications he took made his answers halting and uncertain. He recalled seeing Dave leave the house late the previous night and Sheila returning even later, but he couldn't confirm a time. Did he dream it, or was it real? Jason's frustration at his own mind grew. He wanted to help, but his memories felt jumbled, like disjointed fragments of a puzzle he couldn't put together. In the hours ahead, those fragments would become crucial, especially when Jason's recollections sharpened in moments of shocking clarity. As the day wore on, Deaconess Jessica Taylor found herself at the center of swirling suspicion. Several teenagers who knew Paula well whispered that Paula had confided family troubles to Jessica. After the morning's terrible discovery, some believed Paula might have been running from something within the home. Jessica, unsure how much she should share without betraying Paula's confidence, decided she had no choice but to speak candidly with Detective Phillips. She revealed Paula seemed stressed about moral failings within the family. Jessica never pressed for specifics, but Paula indicated it was serious enough to consider going public at Sunday service. The deaconess also mentioned Paula had asked if the church had any resources for women facing domestic issues. That question now loomed large in Jessica's mind. Had Paula been threatened? To Detective Phillips, this was a flashing neon sign that something more insidious lurked behind the scenes. Paula's death might not be random or a runaway gone wrong. Phillips now had a working theory. Paula discovered something so serious, she felt compelled to expose it, and got silenced. Detective Lorraine Phillips wasted no time after those initial interviews. She launched a series of targeted interrogations and cross-referenced every detail from the Hendricks and Johnson families. Paula's phone records showed her last text came from Dave's number late Saturday night, urging her to meet him privately. Dave had omitted that in his statement. Surveillance footage. A security camera near the main road caught two vehicles driving toward the unfinished housing development around the same time Paula disappeared. One was similar to Dave's sedan, the other resembled Sheila's SUV. Inconsistent timelines. Sheila's alibi fell apart when neighbors admitted they saw her car leave the driveway late that night, contradicting her claim of being home reading. Phillips pressed each suspect on these emerging facts. Pastor Dave stuck to vague explanations, saying Paula had borrowed his phone. Sheila claimed she simply went for a late-night drive due to insomnia. But the inconsistencies were glaring. In a moment of lucidity, Jason Johnson approached Detective Phillips with shaky resolve. He confessed that he remembered seeing Sheila in a heated conversation with Dave around midnight. Though his PTSD blurred exact details, he recalled hearing something about stopping Paula. At the time, he'd chalked it up to a misunderstanding. Phillips listened intently, recognizing the significance of Jason's testimony. He was Paula's grandfather, had no clear motive to lie, and had observed Dave and Sheila in the same location at an incriminating hour. In a tense interview, Phillips showed Dave the camera footage. "We know you were there, Pastor," she said calmly. "You want to tell me why?" Dave's face turned ashen. He mumbled about going to search for Paula, stumbling over his own timeline. Phillips noted every contradiction, every flicker of panic. The breakthrough came when Deaconess Jessica Taylor approached Detective Phillips with a piece of paper, Paula's handwriting. A brief note Paula had slipped her just days before her death, one that read, "Grandma and Dad, something wrong. We'll reveal everything on Sunday if he doesn't confess." This was the final puzzle piece. Faced with mounting evidence, text records, surveillance footage, Jason's testimony, and Paula's own words, Pastor Dave broke down. Dave sobbed, confessing that he and Sheila had lured Paula out late Saturday night, terrified she would expose their affair. He claimed it was Sheila who brandished the cloth with a chemical, but admitted he helped restrain Paula. "I'm so sorry," he kept repeating, tears streaming. "I never meant for this to happen, but I was trapped." He provided enough detail to confirm Sheila's direct involvement sealing her fate as well. Sheila, upon learning of Dave's confession, erupted in rage, betrayed that he hadn't kept their pact of silence. She tried shifting blame entirely onto him, insisting he coerced her. But the evidence was overwhelming. Her car near the scene, her fabric fibers on Paula's clothing, and Dave's testimony. She was placed under arrest within hours. For Mitchell Hendricks, the revelations were beyond comprehension. The husband she'd trusted and her own mother had colluded to murder her daughter. In an emotional confrontation at the jail, Mitchell demanded answers from Dave, screaming, "Why? Why would you do this? She was our child." Dave could barely lift his head. His guilt-ridden mumbles offered no real comfort. Mitchell left in tears, vowing never to speak to him again. She felt equally betrayed by Sheila, who'd raised her, someone she once admired and loved. When the news reached Jason, his mind spun into a storm of self-reproach. How many chances had he missed to intervene? The memory of overhearing Sheila's conversation with Dave haunted him. If only he'd acted sooner. Could Paula have been saved? He suffered a severe PTSD episode that evening, requiring medical intervention. The tragedy had cost him a granddaughter and shattered what remained of his marriage. Dave's attorneys urged him to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. He confessed fully in court, detailing the affair and explaining how fear and blackmail led to murder. The court handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, citing the especially heinous nature of murdering one's own child to hide an affair. Sheila maintained her innocence until the bitter end, casting herself as a victim of Dave's manipulative influence. The jury didn't buy it. With evidence of her direct role in subduing Paula, she too received a life sentence. Grace of Mercy Church became a place of raw grief and uncertainty. Some members left, unable to set foot in the sanctuary once led by a murderer. Others stayed, believing the community could heal through faith and accountability. Deaconess Jessica stepped forward as a guiding figure, offering counseling and leading a push for greater transparency and spiritual health. Brother Marcus, shaken by the fulfillment of his ominous dream about scattering treasure, eventually requested a transfer, finding the church's sorrow too heavy to bear. Mitchell, shattered by loss and betrayal, moved out of state with Jason, who entered a specialized PTSD program. Despite her anguish, she vowed to keep Paula's memory alive by speaking out about hidden family traumas and the danger of unchecked secrets. Dave languished in prison, consumed by regret. Every sermon he'd ever preached about love and righteousness now felt like a cruel mockery. Sheila retreated into silent bitterness, blaming Dave, blaming Paula, blaming fate, but never fully admitting her own monstrous choices. In the end, Paula Hendricks's tragic death became a cautionary tale, a harrowing example of how lust, fear, and secrecy can morph into the unthinkable. A father and grandmother entrusted with her care instead orchestrated her end to protect their own sins. And in doing so, they destroyed everything they claimed to hold dear. Evil thrives in the dark, but once exposed to the light of truth, no lie can survive long. The small Florida town moved forward, forever changed, reminded that even those we admire most can harbor terrifying secrets, and that justice, while slow, is ultimately inescapable.